Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for what will hopefully be a series of speakers over some amount of time. It's up to just follow.
The light thing kind of just shifted. I think it had been propped up.
Don't stand under that one.
Okay, anyways, a series on environmental history and energy history. And we have our first speaker, Dan Mcfarlane. So I want to welcome you to Toronto Metropolitan University. Our city is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. And the Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. So we're pleased to welcome Professor Mcfarlane from Western Michigan University to our campus this afternoon, learn more about his research and his latest book on Canada-U.S. Diplomacy and the role of environmental and energy factors in shaping the long and complicated relationship between these two North American nation states. Professor Mcfarlane is an accomplished environmental historian and diplomatic historian, if you'll let me call him that. And he is a longtime executive member of the Network in Canadian History and Environment, which is a scholarly organization for environmental historians and historical geographers in Canada. He's the author of 3 monographs and 2 edited collections. I'm almost reluctant to run this down because I'm feeling ashamed after reading this, but this is quite an impressive publication record. All of which examine different aspects of diplomatic and environmental histories of Canada-U.S. relations, with an emphasis on the two countries' water borders and the Great Lakes region. His first book, Negotiating a River, Canada, the U.S., and the Creation of the St. Lawrence Seaway, was published by University of British Columbia Press in 2014. This book charts the history of the development of one of the world's largest hydraulic systems for transportation of power. It was in this book that he first introduced important new ideas into the field of environmental history that mix methods and findings from both environmental history and diplomatic history. His second book, Fixing Niagara, Environment, Energy, and Engineers at the World's Most Famous Waterfall, also published by UBC Press, this time in 2020, follows similar themes in its exploration of the hydraulic engineering and waterscaping that went into the development of Niagara Falls as an economic engine for both energy production and tourism. And his first edited collection, Border Flows, A Century of the Canadian-American Water Relationship, was published by University of Calgary Press in 2016, co-edited with Lynn Heasley. The book offers a broad look at Canada and the United States' shared water borders from the Great Lakes to the Northwest Passage, the Salish Sea. It's an impressive collection of 19 chapters covering water history, law, and policy from both local and transnational perspectives. And then his most recent edited collection, also published with University of Calgary Press, I'm seeing a trend here. It's stay with one press a couple of times and then move on. This one was co-edited with Murray Clayman, called The First Century of the International Joint Commission. And that builds further upon his previous studies of Canada-U.S. water relations by examining the body that oversees the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, the treaty that governs the protection of shared waterways between Canada and the United States. It's described as a definitive history of the International Joint Commission. The book covers the full breadth of the history of the IJC, revealing its integral role in shaping diplomatic relations between Canada and the US, which brings us to 2023 and the publication of Natural Allies, Environment, Energy, and History of the US-Canada Relations, published by McGill-Queen's University Press this year. This book takes a broader view of the diplomatic history of the United States and Canada. It makes new arguments for thinking about US-Canada relations through an environmental and energy lens. This is the subject of Professor Mcfarlane's talk this afternoon, and I look forward to learning more about this important new research. Dan.
Thank you very much, Sean, for the nice introduction, and for those of you for being here. That's such a good introduction, I maybe don't have to give a talk. I just summarized everything so we can just all go home. But what I will try to do is give a not too long attempt to summarize key points of this book, which in some ways is also just allowed me to crib from my previous books to a larger extent than I ever have before. Because it is a bit of a, this is much more of a synthetic survey than, you know, writing a whole book about one waterfall or something like that. So it also means it's a book built on the great scholarship by a lot of other people who I borrow from. So it's synthetic in that way. Probably the central conceit of this book is that understanding the history of Canada-U.S. relations means understanding and foregrounding energy and environment, arguing that Canada-U.S. relations has always fundamentally been about the environment, even going back to the time of Confederation, and especially since the start of what we often call the Great Acceleration or the Anthropocene. So I think those can be dated to different times, but starting roughly in the mid-20th century. Since then, Canada and the US have had the most consequential environmental and energy relationship of any countries in the world, whether measured by how much energy, the volume of it, the worth of it, all of those factors, as well as different types of natural resources. Also, no other two countries have produced near as many noteworthy international law and environmental agreements. Canada and the US, as I'll show, have over 50 agreements that have to do primarily or partly with environmental issues. I'm not going to try to go over all of them because that would be far too many and probably get a little bit boring. But the point is that you could argue that these are the two countries, not only they traded the most in terms of natural resources, shared the longest border and cooperatively manipulated and changed it together, but they've also been the most important nation dyad in terms of contributing to international environmental governance standards of international environmental law, in terms of setting precedents with some of the things I'll talk about, like the Boundaries Treaty, the Trail Smelter decision, and things like that. So the point is that this is a pretty important bilateral relationship by many measurements, the biggest in the world. I mean, indeed, until recently when China-U.S. trade moved into #1, Canada-U.S. trade had been the most in terms of billions of dollars per day for decades, so many two countries in the world. Despite all that, historians of American foreign relations basically ignore Canada, and historians of Canada-U.S. relations tend to ignore environmental and energy factors, reducing them to quick mentions or footnotes. And this is an attempt basically to rewrite the history of Canada-U.S. relations exclusively from the perspective of the environmental and energy issues, and to demonstrate you could write the history of that bilateral relationship entirely with that sort of emphasis. So this is very much blending environmental and international or diplomatic history.
I think it's left and right.
So, as I'm saying, this comes from very much building upon those other books that are up there, as if I was joking, to crib from them to a certain extent, which makes research a lot better. I mean, this book came out of was in 2012 when I was a postdoc. I created a course on the history of Canada-U.S. environmental relations, and so it did a lot of the heavy lifting for it to become this book when I wrote all the lectures. Far too much work as a postdoc at that time, when you get paid a little bit to teach one class and you put in all your time into that for 4 months. But it paid off later to justify it by those lectures becoming the backbone in many ways of what would emerge as this book. So, as I mentioned, this sort of works in the traditional Canada-U.S. survey format, and then it moves mostly chronologically, but as well, it's also interspersed or divided up thematically. Water is a pretty recurrent theme, so a number of chapters are just on water, a number of chapters are just on energy, so roughly chronological, but having to step back and forth between them. And I'm thinking, seeing my audience, I think there's more interest in the environmental maybe than the diplomatic. I just gave a talk earlier today, but it was more about the diplomatic side of things. That was more of the audience. So this time I think I'll emphasize probably the environmental history, maybe a little bit more. And so a key part of that is the argument that, which environmental historians would easily buy into, that nature is a powerful historical actor, and that the materiality and characteristics of the types of resources that I'll be talking about have had profound implications for human politics and diplomacy. So, jumping ahead there. So this is the table of contents, as I was just alluding to. It is on the left. So roughly chronological, but also moving somewhat thematically, as you can tell by some of the titles. The next slide is a table that's in the book outlining all the major environmental and energy issues since 1900 in the Canada-U.S. relationship. This is useful to just illustrate, hey, there actually is a lot of stuff that they do. I won't bother trying to get through even close to the majority of things on here, but this is more just to represent how much there actually is. And of course, the book goes into all of these in more detail. So what I'll probably do is move fairly quickly to the Confederation to Second World War period, just to give you some highlights of that tonight. Yeah, a little more into the post-1945 period, because that's when the relationship really intensifies even further, and a lot of the consequential things that we're dealing with today are handled in that period. That's not to say that there wasn't environmental diplomacy going on before 1945. In fact, as I'll try to show you, most of Canada-U.S. relations, even in the late 19th century, was mostly about natural resources, fisheries, and all these sorts of things. So, because historians haven't done that much work on environmental diplomacy compared to political scientists or international relations scholars, those fields have tended to define environmental diplomacy as being mostly about post-1970s environmental protection, such as climate change, the United Nations. But what I'm suggesting in this book is anything that deals with environment, including environmental degradation, should be considered environmental diplomacy. And so with that type of understanding of what constitutes environmental diplomacy, a lot of early Canada-U.S. relations was really about the natural environment. So, as I said, natural resources were a key part of the bilateral North American relationship right from the beginning. In fact, they're pretty key in Canada getting independence from Britain in terms of controlling its foreign policy. Britain still controlled Canadian foreign policy, more or less, into the 20th century. Well, part of what I argue is one of the reasons Canada was able to get quicker independence was because it's often having to negotiate on things like a border water or fisheries where officials in England have no idea about what's going on with that issue, whereas Canadian officials did, so they were given more leeway to be independent. So it's actually the fact that they were dealing with natural resources. It's one of the reasons Canada is able to get its diplomatic independence quickly. And indeed, environmental resources are pretty instrumental in the period that's called sort of the cleaning of the slate with trilateral Canadian, British, American relations, Canada getting more diplomatic independence. An example of that is the first treaty Canada ever signs independently. That's the 1871 Treaty of Washington. It deals with a number of things coming out of the US Civil War. From the Canadian perspective, it's the fisheries aspects that are on the East Coast that are most important. And that's what the signer of the Treaty for Canada, John A. Macdonald, was most concerned with, is whether to give Americans access to the fisheries. Really, the Alaskan boundary dispute after that. It's about borders and territory, but it's inherently environmental in lots of ways. Gold rush, who controls inlets, who controls canals. So that's pretty key to Canada, seeing that or feeling like Britain was sacrificing Canadian interests in order to improve British-American relations. This helps push Canada more towards taking care of its own international diplomacy itself. And then the early phases of what will decades later emerge with agreements about Niagara Falls, St. Lawrence River, Columbia River, and things like that is this period, and starting in the 1890s when we have International Deep Waterways Convention and the first major developments of hydroelectricity at Niagara Falls, which involved the first international exports of electricity out of anywhere in the world. So we start seeing Canadian electricity being sent over the border into the United States. Now, to just give some indication of how key environmental diplomacy is at the time, in a meeting of the Canadian Prime Minister and the US Secretary of State in 1905, the US Secretary of State lists the top 5 issues in Canada and US relations. 4 out of the 5 are environmental, so seals, North Atlantic fisheries, inland fisheries, basically meaning the Great Lakes, as well as boundary waters. Those issues would, in the subsequent period, especially sort of a decade after 1908, would be a particularly fruitful period in terms of arriving at a number of natural resource treaties. You can see the list here. We have the Boundary Waters Treaty in 1909, which is the same year Canada finally gets its own Department of External Affairs. The year before that is the Inland Fisheries Treaty. And we've got a whole list of different fish treaties here. In fact, one of the big C.P. Stacy, who's a big name within Canadian international history, defense policy, and all that. He called it the tiresome and irksome iteration of the fisheries question in Canadian diplomacy. It always was about fisheries, stupid fisheries, over and over again. A lot of these treaties, it should be pointed out, are agreed to, but then aren't enacted because the U.S. Senate won't approve for various reasons. So that's part of the reason I keep getting these same names reoccurring, is that these agreements take place between diplomats, but then they aren't ratified. Usually it's by the U.S. and often it's sectional or special interests who are convincing their Senate representatives to not agree to this. Nonetheless, we see this whole range of fur seal convention for Pribilof Islands in the Pacific, cod fisheries agreements for the East Coast, a migratory bird treaty between Canada-U.S., which is actually quite successful and is still often seen as is still in place and is seen as one of the first ever international environmental protection agreements. You know, a number of halibut and salmon agreements, some dealing mostly with the West Coast, as well as the Great Lakes and the East Coast. And early agreements on the St. Lawrence, Niagara, Great Lakes Basin, but again, those three cases, 29, 32, and 41, are Canada-U.S. arrive at agreements, but it never actually gets enacted for various reasons, usually the U.S. or special interests saying no. It's worth pointing out the Boundary Waters Treaty because it'll be so instrumental because it creates that International Joint Commission, which then becomes heavily involved in the border waters negotiations and treaties that follow. It's also worth pointing out the 1923 halibut treaty because that's the first time Canada ever signs a treaty by itself. So it's an important nation building step that usually gets into the traditional literature of Canada-U.S. relations, but not because it's about fish, that part. But it's equally important, I think, because it's about fish. Later on in the 1970s, the Canadian one of the Canadian diplomats will meet with Henry Kissinger, who you've probably heard of, and he opens with, "I hope you haven't come to talk to me about the sex life of salmon." So it kind of gives an example of how much fish become this reoccurring issue within Canada-U.S. relations. And what I add that usually gets underplayed, but when fish are perennially such an important concern, that very much sets the baseline or sort of gives ballast to the ship of state, setting the tone for a lot of other aspects of Canada-U.S. relations as well. And so see this table up here. This is moving away from hydroelectricity as a type of energy, but fossil fuels aren't that controversial aspect of energy diplomacy in the first half of the 20th century, mainly because it's fossil fuel diplomacy mostly looks like the U.S. sending coal to Canada, which is what this table illustrates. Both because it's on most of that coming to Toronto. In fact, you can almost see through the buildings out there where there would have been the mountains of coal stacked up when it came across Lake Ontario. Special ferries for that purpose to bring Pennsylvania coal across and distribute it out from there. Coal is not as controversial, partly because it's Canada just importing it and it's needed, so there's not much question of whether they're going to try to bring it in. It's more private companies and not as much the government getting involved. Also, I think it's because whereas electricity, oil and natural gas require some type of permanent infrastructural conduits like electricity lines or pipelines, those need agreements, whereas this doesn't require any of those. It can just be ad hoc. Ship comes across, drops it off. It doesn't, for that reason, it doesn't really become something that attracts the attention of diplomats too much compared to what will happen with cross-border electricity and cross-border fossil fuels. In the meantime, among some of the other larger hydroelectric developments, there's just a list of all of the different transborder issues or developments that are going on in the first half of the 20th century, or between 1920 and 1940. So a number on the East Coast, a number on the West Coast, and on the prairies, and in the Pacific Northwest. So you can see a whole range of names there, which in the book I go into more detail about, but I won't do so here. Also, Quebec joining Ontario and sending a lot of its electricity at this time period to the United States, and I would suggest that the experience of regulating the electricity trade will very much end up conditioning how the National Energy Board is set up, and that's how fossil fuel imports, what they will later look like when Canada starts exploring those on a large scale. I think I've mentioned in passing already, Trail Smelter. So this is a case where the emissions from a BC smelter organization are complex, are blowing across the border, causing harm, especially to agriculture in Washington State. So this becomes a problematic diplomatic issue. It's sort of become blown up into more than just a localized cross-border dispute because of the final ruling, which enshrines the principle of the polluter pays. So for that reason, it's sort of become a staple of international environmental law, more so than maybe just what its actual significance at the time might have suggested, or it's well known in international law for that reason. Although even though it's heralded for that reason, it was actually very much a missed opportunity to set much tighter regulations, because what you had was Canada-U.S. officials and scientists were working together, so that was noteworthy in the way they would work in a cross-border fashion. But the U.S. smelter industry, not wanting to be policed itself, was feeding information to the Canadian smelter to try to, as an example of trying to game the policy system to keep regulations low. Even though the scientists came up with a lot of findings that anticipated more modern, later 20th century emphasis on bioaccumulation and how these things worked, a lot of that was maybe too cutting edge and wasn't factored in. So it could have been a lot tighter regulations, even though this is known for enshrining that polluter pays principle, which is an important principle nonetheless. So that's more or less covers me trying to quickly move through the pre-Second World War period and hit some of the highlights. So moving into World War II, this very much is a hinge point signaling the massive intensification of the Canada-U.S. environmental energy relationship. So it just takes off during the war and continues on an upward trajectory afterward. I mean, both countries lead the globe in expanding their hydroelectric capacity during the war. There's a gargantuan amount of mining, extraction, smelting, metals, minerals to support the war effort, and armaments, all of which, of course, has a tremendous environmental cost. That includes Canadian plutonium at Chalk River, uranium from Saskatchewan and Northern Ontario. Initially, those go into the nuclear armaments industry, but because a lot of later Canadian uranium exports will be going towards energy production for peaceful uses of nuclear materials, it becomes an energy aspect of Canadian energy diplomacy that's often subordinated to fossil fuels and electricity as well. During the war, the US cooperatively builds infrastructural projects on Canadian territory with Canada. So the Alaskan Highway, the Camel Pipeline. And so along with hydroelectricity, we're seeing a ramping up of cooperative efforts at building energy projects. And then in terms of uranium ore, between 1942 and 1952, Eldorado, Canada sends about 2,500 tons of uranium to the United States. So moving out of the war, this is a zoomed in segment of that big table I showed you earlier. So this is just focusing on the 1950 to about 1980, just showing you the range of major issues in that 30-year time period. So again, I won't bother trying to cover all of these, but if everyone, this is also partly for, since I can't get close to covering everything, in case someone has a topic they want to cover. Hopefully they'll see it there. No, I'm not giving it short shrift either. So talk about it in this presentation, the content that's in the book, and I can have questions afterward about it. So just to focus on a few of these issues. I mean, obviously I'm partial towards these because I've written books about them, but probably half of this audience, which may not be saying much, has heard me speak ad nauseum about some of these subjects before too, so I won't go into them in too much detail, except to say these become some of the Columbia, Niagara, and St. Lawrence negotiations aren't just about issues of diplomacy. These become the preeminent diplomatic issues, regardless of being environmental issues, that dominate much of Canada-U.S. relations of any type in this time period. So we have American officials saying around 1953 that the St. Lawrence Seaway is the top issue, bar none, even more so than the Korean War in terms of Canadian-American relations. So it just speaks to how big of a deal environmental issues are becoming. Now, the reason that becomes a controversy is Canada tries to build the Seaway itself without American participation, which America kind of says, well, we don't think it's a good idea to allow Canada to control what can come into the heart of the continent through the Great Lakes. So I don't think we're going to allow Canada, patent ahead, to be the one that gets to do it itself. So That's the focus of the book that was already mentioned, so I won't really kind of go into that in too much detail. So just some different maps of flooded out by the Seaway and Power Project. This is a map of development of Niagara Falls. 1950, Canada-U.S. signed what's called the Niagara River Diversion Treaty. Previous efforts to make a transporter agreement with Niagara Falls have been complicated by being wrapped up in the St. Lawrence negotiations, and as those get repeatedly stalled, they separate Niagara out pretty easily and quickly arrive at a treaty. Both the St. Lawrence and Niagara cases also involve what seem to be the first major cases where provinces and states get a role in diplomacy because of their jurisdictional role over hydroelectricity. So in the jargon of diplomacy, there's subnational governments become involved in the first time in a major way in negotiating some of these issues. That of course become the case as well with fossil fuels later on in Alberta and things like that. A key thing though is the US starts really amplifying and bringing in a lot of Canadian resources that it identifies. For example, there's something called the Paley Report as being key to US fighting the Cold War. So Canada becomes formally identified as a key supplier of aluminum and minerals and all, electricity, all these types of things. But we shouldn't let us think that it meant that the US actually had a coherent policy towards Canada. Indeed, it was still very much ad hoc and reactive. For the most part, American diplomats rarely thought about Canada too much or didn't take it for granted. There was no grand plan to get Canadian resources as part of the point. In fact, it's more American corporations that are heavy lifting. So to the extent there's critiques of American imperialism with resources, many of which I am susceptible to and share, but that can get overblown in this period. It's actually Canadian officials trying to get markets for Canadian products, pushing and begging the United States to take their resources. In the case of fossil fuels, for example, at this time period, the US is reluctant to take in Canadian oil because it wants to protect its domestic producers as well as not upset American and Venezuelan relations about oil as well. So even though there's certainly many cases where we can identify American imperialism towards Canadian resources, it's easy to oversimplify it as Americans just seeking to extract Canadian staples. Point is that resource colonialism is as much about Canada pushing for those industries, as well as we shouldn't ignore the fact that, say again, in the fossil fuel industry and many others, it's American-owned companies operating as subsidiaries or branch plants in Canada. So there is, to a certain extent, the owners of certain companies dealing with mining and fossil fuels are subsidiaries of American companies. So of course, they're going to make certain decisions based on the interests of American companies. Even a lot of some of the first hydroelectric stations on Niagara Falls on the Canadian side are owned by American parent companies. So that's why they're exporting so much of the electricity back across the border. So with Niagara Falls, this is something I've talked a lot before and I like to talk about, but I will keep it brief. Essentially, this treaty, what it does is it allows Canada-U.S. to formally divvy up the water of Niagara Falls. So between 8 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night, the treaty says they have to leave half of the water going over the waterfall, and the other half is diverted through tunnels for hydroelectric production. At 10 p.m. at night, that switches to 1/4 of the water goes over the waterfall, and the other 3/4 get diverted. And then from November till spring and non-tour season, it's permanently 24 hours on the clock. That same scenario where only 1/4 of the water is going over, then the 3/4 is being diverted. So pretty massive manipulation of a natural icon. You can imagine if you've got 1/4 of the water going over, it's not going to look very good anymore. Tourist industry doesn't like that. So the treaty also includes stipulations of how they're going to physically remake the Horseshoe Falls and shrink it to hide the fact that you have much as volume of water. Because if you don't have as much water, if you just put it in a much smaller space, it looks like it's still just as full of water. So that's what this map shows. The red dashed areas where they carve out the sides of Niagara Falls to redistribute the flow more evenly. The green is where they put in fill. So if you go to the Horseshoe Falls today, where you would stand to look at it, but they call it rock today, that used to be part of the waterfall until the 1950s. Now it gets reclaimed because they shrink the actual level of the waterfall by several hundred feet to do that, and do a number of other remedial works, basically freeze it in place, because it also helps note that it erodes several feet per year naturally. So over a long period of time, it's going to move away from the tourist infrastructure. And you don't want that. So a lot of this is about freezing it in place and making it still look good aesthetically, but to trick people into not thinking that there's all of the waterway. So this is an interesting case. This is not very controversial diplomatic. They're very much in agreement about doing this. So it's more significant, I think, from an environmental history perspective, necessarily a diplomatic one. The other in the big three of the cross-border mega projects that have been negotiations started back in the late 19th century or early 20th century, but it takes until the post-World War II period. The other one is the Columbia River Treaty. Jumps ahead. So we have here first, the International Joint Commission gives recommendations and studies as early as 1930s, 1940s, and negotiations about it. A formal treaty is signed in 1961. The British Columbia Premier doesn't agree to it. Matters stall. They go back to the table. Here's the government replaces the Diefenbaker government, and what's called the Niagara River or the Niagara Columbia Protocol is signed in 1964. Basically, a new treaty, but it's ending the 1961 treaty, changing some of the provisions. Along the way, some of the same Canadian officials who had tried to push for the all-Canadian Seaway had pushed for an all-Canadian Columbia River project, where it wouldn't involve American involvement, but would have been different diversions to keep, for example, diverting water to the Fraser River to develop hydroelectricity there instead of letting it all go down to the United States. The final treaty that does end up happening, a key provision is that the dams in Canada are providing flood control downstream in the U.S. and Canada, where BC gets payments in lieu of that. The nature of that had been a major sticking point for the treaty, and Bennett had resisted some of it, and that had been a target of the opposition that won an all-Canadian Columbia project as well. Just like is the case also with the Niagara and St. Lawrence projects, the Columbia River involves pretty significant amounts of what we call hydraulic imperialism, right, which is the targeting of the indigenous communities as the expendable ones who can be pushed out of the way for the reservoirs that are on the territory, and then treating them very much as second-class citizens compared to white residents who are also displaced, but are treated very differently. In fact, because of the propensity for the types of locations that make for good hydroelectric development, are also historically the types of places indigenous communities would have used in the past. So they often those sites are parts of their traditional territory. So there's also disproportionate impacts, aside of the clear mistreatment on the part of the Canadian state in that regard. And of course, there's going to be lots of ecological repercussions to flooding out vast amounts of territory for hydroelectricity. We've only come to realize more recently that all the foliage and green matter that's in these reservoirs is actually a methane time bomb. So it's, despite electricity being called renewable, it's actually, when these big reservoirs start, they're a pretty big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So on top of the other reasons for resisting large hydroelectric developments, the fact that they actually contribute to climate change more than they help reduce in terms of removing carbon emissions needs to be kept in mind. Even as these big three hydroelectric projects are finally being brought to a conclusion and actually built, sort of ironically, at the same time, fossil fuels are now passing electricity as the most important aspect of Canada-U.S. trade, especially Canadian exports. Right? So in the 50s and 60s, as I've touched on before, it's Canada trying to convince the U.S. to relax its foreign quotas of fossil fuels, getting exceptions for Canadian oil to come in. So this is going through the Diefenbaker and then into the Pearson governments. So that, of course, involves the Diefenbaker government setting up essentially the program where west of the Ottawa Valley will be supplied, in Canada will be supplied by Canadian oil. East of that will be supplied by foreign oil, mostly Venezuelan oil. So that's often seen as, American imperialism, and certainly that's a reflection of the interests of Standard Oil being a parent company to Canadian interests. But what can be missed within that is Canadian government and Alberta is very much interested in this system. Because what it allows them to do is, instead of Alberta having to supply fossil fuels east of Ontario, Venezuelan oil is cheaper So they can import that for cheap and sell Canadian oil to the US for more than they're paying for the Venezuelan oil. So it's actually in Canada's interest to, in this sense, to set up that type of system. The board is created in this period too, and some of the first pipelines, of course, the great Canadian pipeline debate, with the Trans-Canada natural gas pipeline is coming on, interprovincial pipeline, coming later, Enbridge builds its pipeline from the west to the head of the Great Lakes, and then adds on its other numbered lines throughout the Great Lakes. Line 3, line 5 is built in the 1950s, which is now the pipeline that was built in the 1950s is still there and crosses through Michigan's state under the water in the Straits of Mackinac. So I bring that up because I live in Michigan, and that's one of the biggest issues in Michigan is Canadian oil coming through that doesn't really even come to Michigan because it just continues on to Sarnia. So it's just a shortcut through the US, through a very dangerous and perilous spot in the Straits of Mackinac where there's been a lot of spills and strikes already, or strikes from anchors and that sort of thing. So these pipelines are 7 years old too, as part of the worry. And of course, it's an Enbridge pipeline that burst in 2010 into the Kalamazoo River. I live in Kalamazoo. I was living there at the time, but I taught classes on it and whatever else will happen. I've taken classes kayaking where it happened. So for that reason, people are fairly for good reason distrustful of Enbridge in that region. So that's one of the pipelines that's built back in the 1950s in this area. And so of course, spills, I talk about spills in the book and I draw from Sean's work quite extensively to talk about just how frequently those spills are happening, giving us pause of what's officially announced in terms of the spills we hear about. Like the Canada-U.S. one was probably over 1 million gallons, even though they claim it was only 700,000. But as if 700,000 isn't bad. How big the fine is dependent upon how many liters or gallons of spill. So it's in there. But they recovered more than 1 million gallons of oil from the river. So that's their not just not magically some other way. I don't know where it came from. Of course, the Trudeau government is going to reset the Canada-U.S. natural gas and oil relationship in a lot of ways, and this tends to be fairly well known with the National Energy Program, trying to increase the Canadianization of that, so I don't need to say a whole lot about it. But aside of that, it's where more pipelines are being built. 2 different treaties are signed in 1977 about pipelines that will go from one country to the other, basically saying they won't interfere with each other. The 1977 Pipeline Transit Treaty was not controversial at the time, but it's now what Canada invokes to say it doesn't have to take its pipelines out of Michigan territory if Michigan wants it to because of that treaty. We also have oil tankers in the Arctic, and the Arctic is becoming a much bigger issue in the 70s and 80s. It's actually, the Arctic is probably one of those exceptions where historians always have said a lot about environmental diplomacy in this area. So we definitely talk about it a lot in the book, but for the reason that people have talked about it a lot, I won't say too much about it in this presentation. Alongside that, we found a whole host of increasing intensification of metals and minerals, asbestos and aluminum and all these types of things, lead, copper, huge amounts. A lot of these industries in Canada are predicated upon being financially viable because it's going to be exported to the US or they're owned by American parent companies. So those developments wouldn't happen if it wasn't for those exports. But also, the 1970s, one of the other major environmental agreements is the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements. So for this picture up here of Trudeau and the Senior and Nixon signing the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. 50th anniversary of that was just last year. So these were considered major accomplishments within the broader sphere of global environmental law at the time. Basically, the 2 countries agreeing to phase out and get rid of a lot of pollutants going into the Great Lakes. And the 72 agreement is actually quite successful because it pushes it's trying to get rid of nutrients, especially phosphorus and nitrogen runoff, getting into the Great Lakes, causing eutrophication, like the area being declared dead at the time, the Cuyahoga River's catching on fire in Cleveland. So it actually does manage to pretty quickly clean that up. Main reason is actually because the US spends $10 billion on water treatment plants, maybe not too much because of the agreement, but that agreement does help pave the way for that. There's another Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement superseding this one in 1978. It's much more ambitious. It has some of the first ever international applications of the ecosystem principle, which is some of which that science has developed as part of this agreement, seeing the interplay of how pollution comes in through terrestrial as well as air and water sources and next. So it's often seen as a model internationally for that reason, even though it's in some ways not near as successful as an agreement, probably because it just would be very hard for it to be. It's so ambitious. Governments aren't really willing to stop companies from producing most of the things that lead to the new types of toxic pollutants that are being identified in this agreement. So in some ways, now, especially when you add in PFAS, microplastics, all these things nowadays, you could argue the Great Lakes are actually worse now in terms of toxic pollution than they were back when we were all concerned about it. But because they're not as visual in terms of causing massive eutrophication, algae and things like that, people tend to think of them as being cleaner than they were in the past. Other top issues in this time period are law of the sea, which has to do with jurisdiction for how offshore waters, is it 100 miles or 200 miles, how much does Canada control, which is pretty important, or becomes important later on for not only for fisheries and in the Arctic, but for offshore oil developments and different minerals. So it's still something that's working itself out today as a diplomacy from that period. But that is, again, like the Arctic, that's something that has actually been fairly well recorded by historians and law scholars. I don't say quite as much about that at this time period. Along with Great Lakes water quality, invasive species in the Great Lakes are starting to rear their head at this time, which becomes a matter of Canada-U.S. relations, but for an example, failed relations. They don't effectively do what they could have to keep a lot of these species out. Other issues, there's other agreements about different types of pollution, different species crossing the border, so we see a rise of agreements on ducks and more bird fisheries treaties and things like that. Another concern is air pollution. So in the 1970s, acid rain was something no one had even heard of, more or less. By the 1980s, it was the top issue in Canada-U.S. relations, largely because of U.S. emissions coming north into Ontario, and especially because those are hitting cottage country north of Toronto, so there's some vested interest, lots of power and money who aren't happy about this, so it gains a lot of traction with the government for that reason. But it's also pollution for Canada moving into the U.S. We've got, of course, trail smelter and things like that. But this is a picture of Sarnia and Chemical Valley, some of its emissions. The other side is St. Clair River in Michigan. So this is a case where it's pollution from in Ontario moving to Michigan. We've got Atikokan and other, even by Cornwall, there's smelter emissions problems as well. So it's not just the one cases we hear the most about. That's what becomes the emissions and acid rain coming from the US to Canada get the most traction in terms of the Canadian officials. So throughout the 80s, the Mulroney government's pushing for an agreement. The Reagan government has no interest, partly because Reagan wasn't even sure that acid rain's a real thing. But once George W. Bush replaces him as president, there's pretty quickly an agreement to the 1991 Air Quality Agreement. There's a lot of similarities to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, one of them being that it actually is fairly successful, but again, the major reason is because of domestic spending, rather than necessarily the international agreement being a major driver of it. So Mulroney's been called the greenest prime minister, and in some respects that's true. In some other respects it's not, because he's the major driver of the free trade agreements, which basically are nothing but bad for the environment. So I talk about that quite a bit in the book about free trade. All it does is lead, it's great economically in lots of ways, but all it does is lead to a further intensification of exploitation of natural resources. So it's hard to call him a green prime minister when he's, one of the authors of this neoliberal agenda that we still see in place today. But to be fair, he was good on acid rain. He was one of the first ever international leaders to push for a climate agreement in the 1980s. So he helps. The Montreal Protocol happened on the ozone agreement in 1987. Following that, he pushes for some type of climate talks. I think just sort of enjoying the success he's seeing with that, and then maybe sort of backs away from it afterward. But the point being, there's a time in the 1980s where Canada is a leading proponent of maybe an international agreement on climate change, very soon it'll become one of the major villains on that issue, because even whether it's liberal or conservative, Chrétien has no interest, probably because of what he's dealing with recessions and cutting, spending very little issue in addressing climate accords and things like that. So we're going to see the walking back of a lot of spending on environmental regulations and agreements during the Chrétien years. But it's still worth pointing out Canada early on had some interesting occurring. I've already mentioned the free trade agreements. So as I said, that sort of reset, along with the end of the Cold War, helps reset the Canada-U.S. environmental and energy relationship quite a bit, along with adding in, starting to see the tar sands industry coming online in Alberta, and so you start to see those exports. So those things together start to become major issues as we're moving into the 21st century. Other issues in this time period that are maybe small, but become much bigger issues within Canada-U.S. diplomacy, or things like softwood lumber, a dispute over a place called Devil's Lake in North Dakota, and the Garrison diversion about whether it'll send water and pollution into Manitoba. But it's Canada is already, by the start of the 21st century, is already the biggest supplier of fossil fuels to the United States. It's going to increase even more with the development in the tar sands and American investment constituting a lot of that. And so we can talk about the extent to both Canada and the US are becoming petrostates. And we could also add in, before that, they were hydro states. I would suggest in that hydroelectricity helped control the political economy of Ontario, Quebec, BC, in much the same way maybe fossil fuels now dictate a lot of the political economy of the two countries, and of course of Alberta and places like that. We also start to see the infrastructure, like pipelines that had previously been fairly non-controversial, start to become controversial issues. Keystone XL expansion being one of the most obvious examples. The Dakota Access Pipeline, even though it's not a cross-border pipeline, but the Enbridge pipelines, so Line 3, as well as Line 5. And as part of that, what we start to see is much more formal recognition of Indigenous actors within diplomacy. They always had been. The bigger issues maybe that they just weren't listened to very much before, right? In the 1920s, you had Mohawk groups going to the League of Nations to complain about their treatment, including things like developments on the St. Lawrence River and other natural resource exploitation. So they'd already been diplomatic actors, but what's changing is that there's a little maybe more recognition by civil society and less so by governments that these are actual formal diplomatic voices. Because it's been very much Indigenous opposition that's played the leading roles in a lot of these pipelines or trying to stop them. So just an overview of the period from the 80s to the present of some of the key issues. Some of these I've already mentioned in the last few minutes. Just to say on the climate angle too, we might usually think of climate change in terms of climate diplomacy as being a multilateral issue involving many countries in the United Nations. But I think a key point to make is that Canada's position on the different accords and climate change ends up getting very tied to bilateral relations. Basically, what the US does is pretty much going to help determine what Canada thinks it should do. So the US, the fact the US isn't willing to sign on to most of these Canada's, well, it's going to be shooting ourselves in the foot economically if we reduce our carbon emissions. Well, the US isn't. So the fact the US is a laggard villain on this up too helps determine, I think, the reason why Canada is as well, regardless of whether it's, and that's not just for governments like the Harper government, that would have been climate villains regardless, but other liberal governments as well, such as Chrétien and Martin, and despite the good talk we get from the current Trudeau government, action doesn't usually match up to the nice fluffy language about what's going to be done about climate change. Then of course we have, I won't even get into the Trump aspect, because that's just sort of resets again many aspects of Canada's environmental relations, with a lot of that being repaired and redone with Biden coming back to an extent, but it's sort of a lost several years that in many ways on environmental policy sets the US back arguably decades in many of these cases, including pulling out of climate Nonetheless, we still see, of course, Trump's pretty supportive on Canadian fossil fuels, nonetheless. He's also maybe one of the most least Canadian friendly, including maybe someone like Nixon out of the prime ministers in terms of being antagonistic towards Canada. So it does point to some of the ways that the Canadian-American relationship can diverge in important ways when it's not about cooperatively developing natural resources. That sort of is a way to move into the conclusion, which I'd say that the history of North American interchanges, environmental and energy, has had a profound effect on the continent's ecosystems, not just at the border, but landscapes and waterscapes, sometimes far from the border. It's impossible to quantify the environmental impact of all of the trade and resources that has moved across the border, but since it was the world's largest for decades, it's obviously going to be a pretty astronomical environmental impact. So even today, as this complex and busy map tries to show, the intensity of the Canada-U.S. energy relationship is the highest now that it's the deepest it's ever been. So it's the most electricity out of any two countries in the world crosses the border. Fossil fuels out of any two countries. So this is trying to get at some of that. So I mean, I could list off stats, some of which you might be familiar with just the intensity of that relationship, but just a few suffice. The fact that about half of American oil imports come from Canada, so that's a pretty significant amount, not only in terms of total volume, but Canada supplying half of foreign oil to one of the most powerful countries in the world. That's pretty significant. So it does lead to the question of why do American historians ignore Canada so much when it's, there's multiple books on American oil relations with, pick a Middle Eastern country or Venezuela. Is there any book on Canadian-U.S. oil relations? Not really. It's not from a historical perspective. A lot of uranium is being shipped to the United States, all types of different metals and minerals I've talked about. So taking the long view, I would argue that it's the frequent negotiations about natural resources, as I think I've alluded to before, that helps establish the basic day-to-day thrust of a lot of Canada-U.S. relations. So it provides the momentum and ongoing balance for those, crisis events and national security events. We spend a lot of time fretting about why Canada is not important on the national scene when it comes to international security and all these things, while ignoring that it is one of the major players when it comes to environmental and energy factors. And even those environmental energy factors have at times to become the big punctuated climactic event in Canada-U.S. relations. So at various times, as fisheries treaties have been the top issues, Canada-U.S. relations, Seaway and Power Project, Columbia River Treaty, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements, acid rain becomes one of the major issues, and then, fossil fuels and such. A lot of those agreements are not formal treaties, but non-binding agreements, which is another interesting thing I think that is shaped by dealing with natural resources. So it's more informal agreements, but speaking to the way U.S. and Canada work, they don't want to give up a lot of their sovereignty with hard agreements, but things like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements can be canceled very quickly because they're not formal treaties, but executive agreements. But they remain in place because they serve the interests of both countries. And indeed, I suggest in the book that it's because they're so often dealing with natural resources that helps explain why the Canada-U.S. relationship is more prone to cooperation than conflict. It often is in their own mutual self-interest to cooperate rather than have conflict, because many other countries in the world that share waters and things like that are fight over it a lot more. Part of it may be the actual materiality of the waters themselves. The Great Lakes, for example, aren't crossing the border, but forming the border. So it's, whereas the Columbia River is something, for example, that crosses the border, lends itself more to one country trying to take before the other country can get some. The U.S. doing that with waters that go into Mexico. So I think it's that Canada-U.S. cooperation that sometimes is ascribed to the special relationship of the peoples of Canada, the United States, and the British inheritance is actually predicated much more on the practicality, coinciding national interests, and shared environments, I think. So a geographical explanation a long way to fostering that relationship. And it's also because of all those natural resources that made Canada much more important to the US than people might assume if they're from somewhere else. And seeing from an economic and security perspective, the extent to which the US relies on Canada. And it also gives Canada probably more pull than people might expect. Because Canada is so important, it actually makes out pretty good in a lot of these negotiations, where punches above its weight, so to speak, in extracting favorable agreements or treatment from the United States. And so this history also in that way tells us more about the American imperialism, as I talked a bit about, towards Canada. So again, it's often, there's certainly, you can tease out lots of cases of American imperialism, staples extraction, but we have to balance that with how often it was Canada saying, please take our resources, right? And the sort of perennial debate, give up sovereignty versus prosperity. And so for the most part, especially since 1950, Canadian elites were prone to saying what's good for Canadian corporate interests and trade is what's good for the average Canadian. The rising tide lifts all boats type of argument. And for the most part, the Canadian public was agreeing with that as well, willing to give up a bit of sovereignty, even though there, of course, there's lots of nationalist concerns about getting into bed too tightly with the United States. But because that leads to the type of affluence, or pretty close to American level of affluence in Canada, most people are willing to go along with that for that reason. So as I've said, this history of environmental energy diplomacy is in large part responsible, I think, for the cooperative relationship and unprecedented affluence that the two countries share. But that very peace and prosperity is a double-edged sword, because it's what it's done is naturalize a belief in perpetual abundance and growth that has led to the voracious consumption and overconsumption of natural resources that is nowhere close to being sustainable. So even though these are arguably the two most affluent countries in the world, in large part because of this type of environmental diplomacy, no two other countries, I would suggest, are more responsible per capita for our current planetary crises, from climate change to habitat, biodiversity crises to toxic pollution, and so on. So I will end there. Thank you.